Kelsey. This is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I'm wearing one of my fancy booktube hats, and today I'm finally back with another monthly recommendations video. You may have noticed that I haven't been doing monthly recommendations the past 3 months. There is a very specific reason for that. It's because during the last 3 months, the booktube SFF Babbles topics were going on, and I did all of the Babbles videos this year, so there were 2 of those per month, and I just didn't have time to film another recommendations video in each of those months, so I decided, hey, I'm just going to let monthly recommendations sit by the wayside for a little while here, and I'll come back to it in June. And boy, what a topic to be coming back to in June, because this month's topic is retellings. I must admit that this month I was a little nervous to film this video because I think of myself as being like a super good source of retelling recommendations. I was like, what if I actually go to my bookshelves and they're like, aren't that many? And what if everyone who watches me is like already read all of those and I don't have any new recommendations? It's kind of the nature of monthly recommendations videos for me that you'll be seeing a lot of books that I have naturally already talked about on my channel before. But one of the reasons that I like to do these videos is that it gives me a chance to sort of cycle back to some things that I may not have talked about for a while or that you may have missed when I did talk about them, so that books I like continue to get new chances to shine on my channel, sort of under a different light. Every monthly recommendations topic is sort of a lens through which to look at all of the books that fit that topic. So that said, you may have noticed from the thumbnail, it turned out I had plenty of books on my bookshelves. You can't quite see down here, but my shelves here are pilfered. There are big holes because all of the books, they are here. I always start a monthly recommendations video by explaining a bit what my approach to the theme is. For retellings, I'm specifically focusing on books that are direct retellings as opposed to simply fairy tale or folklore or mythology inspired things. I read lots of those too, and if I included them, this list would have been way too long. Some of the things that have made it onto this list, though, are slightly looser retellings as opposed to stricter retellings, and when that's the case, I'll try to make sure to point that out for you. I also thought about how I was going to organize these. I decided to go alphabetically by author. I also went through my shelves on Goodreads just to make sure that nothing was going to get left off the list just because I don't have a physical copy on hand. Now, there are also a whole ton of retellings on my TBR that I am frankly somewhat ashamed that I haven't read some of these yet. When I get to an author that has other retellings out that I haven't read that are on my TBR, I may mention that those books exist and that I plan to read them. And I think that gets all of the necessary introduction out of the way. So the first thing on my list is The Phoenix Dance by Calhoun. I have nothing for authors with last names starting with A or B or diving in with C. This is a young adult retelling of The 12 Dancing Princesses where the protagonist is the shoemaker's apprentice. It's also own voices for bipolar disorder. This takes place in the same fantasy kingdom as her previous young adult novel, Aria of the Sea, and it has some crossover characters that show up from that book, but you don't need to read that one first in order to understand this story. This is a book that I first read as a teenager. Calhoun was one of my favorite authors for a period of time in high school. Unfortunately, most of her books are now out of print. I do think this is the only one of hers that's actually a retelling. Next on the list is a book that I own, but I've loaned out my copy of it right now, and that is Bitter Greens by Kate Forsyth. This is one that I'm going to categorize sort of as a looser retelling. This is a pretty heavy historical fiction novel that is all about the history of the Rapunzel fairy tale. It has 3 narratives, one of which is a Rapunzel story. So this is a 1/3 retelling, but it is all about Rapunzel and it is all about that story and the history that goes along with it. It's definitely an adult book. As I said, it has some pretty heavy content. This is one that I did a full review for, and I'm pretty proud of that review, so you can check that out. Another one that I don't have a copy of is The Sleeper and the Spindle by Neil Gaiman. I've mentioned before that I'm not really a huge Neil Gaiman fan, but this is one that I actually liked. This is a short story that is printed in illustrated book form, and it is a mashup retelling of Snow White and Sleeping Beauty that gets pretty dark and twisty. Continuing with the theme of dark and twisty, the next book I have here is Cruel Beauty by Rosamund Hodge, which is a dark and twisty Beauty and the Beast retelling that has a lot of classical mythology as sort of the backdrop for the story. I read this a few years ago, so it's been a while. It was definitely before I started BookTube. I don't know if I would like this book as much now, given all of the things that I've read since as I did at the time, but I really loved all of the innovative use of mythology in this. I would argue that although this is really marketed and pitched as a Beauty and the Beast retelling, it's actually sort of a mashup of Beauty and the Beast and Bluebeard. I know that sounds really disgusting, and it would be a spoiler to say why it works in this book, but it's really creative and it does. I'm going to keep this held up in the one hand, and on the other hand, I'm going to show you the cover for Crimson Bound, which is Rosamund Hodge's second novel. I have also read this one. I got it from the library. I don't own a copy. This one is another dark, twisty mashup. It's also young adult. It combines a very dark, disturbing, lesser-known version of Little Red Riding Hood with the story of the girl without hands. It's set in a Versailles-inspired setting like Cruel Beauty. It just has a ton of influences that she's working with here. The thing that I realized when I read this book, though, that made me think that I might not like this one as much if I reread it, is a sort of pattern with how Rosamund Hodge writes romances that I don't like. In both of these books, I'm actually fine with the resolution of the romance storyline, but in neither of them am I really okay with how it gets there. Both of these characters have, like, messed up, dark, sexy flings with bad boy characters before they end up in the right sort of relationship at the end, and I just didn't enjoy that. I should mention that while the marketing of these two books makes them look like a pair or a duology, they actually take place in totally separate worlds, and they're both standalones. Rosamund Hodge does have a novella that I haven't read yet. It's only available on Kindle, called Gilded Ashes. This one does apparently take place in the Cruel Beauty universe, and it's a Cinderella retelling, and I do intend to read it eventually. I did not so much care for her newest book, however, Bright Smoke, Cold Fire, which is the first in a Shakespeare retelling duology. Next, I want to mention a book that I own on Kindle, and that is Thorn by Intisar Khanani. This is a young adult Goose Girl retelling, and it's self-published. Next, I have The Seventh Bride by T. Kingfisher, alphabetized under K, even though this is actually Ursula Vernon writing under a pseudonym. Most of her retellings are adult retellings that she writes under the T. Kingfisher name. This is the only one of those that I've read so far, in part because it's the only one that's really available in print form. I am certain that I am going to love all of her other self-published retellings. I just haven't gotten around to them because I haven't had my Kindle for long enough to really figure out how I'm integrating ebooks into my reading schedule. This is one of the ones that is a looser retelling. It is a loose Bluebeard retelling, and while it's technically one of her adult books, I'd argue that this kind of felt YA to me, in part because of the youth and youthful perspective of the protagonist. Next, I've got a couple books by Juliet Marillier. First is Heart's Blood, which is one of her rare standalones. This is a Beauty and the Beast retelling. I know that two of my BookTube friends, Roya from Unicorn Hunter Books and Emily Hornberg, just finished a buddy read of this. So I'll link both of their channels for you because I'm sure they'll both be talking about it soon if they haven't already done so by the time this video goes up. The second Juliet Marillier book I have here that's a retelling is Daughter of the Forest. This is the first in her Seven Waters series that was originally a trilogy and then got expanded into a longer series. I've read the original trilogy. I haven't read the expansion books. I believe this is the only one of those that is a direct retelling, although they all have a very folklore-based approach. This is a retelling of The Wild Swans. It's the story where the girl has all the brothers that get turned into swans. That story. Most of Juliet Marillier's books are folklorish in nature. I only have one more of hers, though, that I know is a retelling that I haven't read. Wildwood Dancing is one of her young adult books. It's a 12 Dancing Princesses retelling, and it's on my TBR. And do you know where we are in the alphabet now? We've made it to McKinley. I'm thinking that it's possible that I should rearrange these by publication date, because right now they're stacked from like smallest on the top to largest on the bottom, and I'm not sure that makes sense. So Robin McKinley is probably best known for her fairy tale retellings. They aren't by any stretch of the imagination all that she has written though, so this is by no means an exhaustive look at what she's done as an author, but I think I do have all of her retellings here. The first one, I have it, but I kinda lied because I'm not going to show you my copy. It's over there under a pile of stuff and it's very water damaged. And I prefer the cover art of this edition, so I'm just going to show you this, is Beauty, which was her debut novel, and it is a kind of considered now classic retelling of Beauty and the Beast. This was published in 1978. This was the first book of hers that I ever read. I had it as a child. I have not reread it in a really long time though. I feel like McKinley is one of those sort of increasingly rare authors who has always written what she writes and then let other people decide whether it's going to be like marketed for younger readers or for adults. A lot of her books have been published in both young adult and adult editions, but Beauty is the book of hers that I think of as most juvenile, and I don't think that's just because I read it when I was a kid. I would caution readers going into this book for the first time as adults that 1, it may strike you as pretty simplistic, and 2, it may strike you as somewhat unoriginal. There are some really strong resemblances between McKinley's Beauty and Disney's Beauty and the Beast. And you may notice the publication on this was 1978, so if someone is stealing from someone, it's Disney that's stealing from McKinley and not the other way around. The next Robin McKinley retelling I have was published in 1988, and that is The Outlaws of Sherwood. This one is a Robin Hood retelling, and it is, I'm going to be completely honest here, my least favorite McKinley book. I felt like it would be really unfair to leave it off this list when all of the other McKinley retellings, literally all of them, were going to be on it. You guys deserve to know at least that this book exists. One of the approaches that McKinley's books sometimes take is to sort of demystify the source material or the type of fantasy that she's writing. And so you get a lot of like kind of really boring practical day-to-day stuff. My favorite example of this is one of her non-retelling books, Dragonhaven, which sort of demystifies the idea of like raising a dragon. In that book, raising a baby dragon is not super glamorous. It's like really tedious and really hard work. But back to Outlaws of Sherwood. She does this with the Robin Hood legend, so this book is basically just a bunch of people trying to figure out how to live in the woods and not get caught. And it's sort of an active demystification of the legend surrounding the main character. And one of the results of this, when it's a Robin Hood retelling, is that this book actually isn't fantasy. It's just historical fiction with some people in the woods. And I got to the end of this book and I was like, there was no magic in this one. This is the only Robin McKinley book that is not fantasy. And in part because of that, and in part because I'm just not super big on Robin Hood stories to begin with, this one doesn't hold my interest the way that her other books tend to. But if you're really into Robin Hood, you might want to check this out. Now, from my least favorite to one of my very favorites, next we have Deerskin, which was published in 1993. This is a retelling of the Perrault fairy tale Donkey Skin, and in contrast to Beauty, which I think of as the most juvenile, I think of this as the most adult of Robin McKinley's books. I would strongly advise you not to give this book to anyone under high school age. Trigger warnings in this for rape and incest. There is one scene in particular in this book that is just very hard to read because it is so brutal. What McKinley does with this story is turn it into this very dark, magical, very poetically written, but still really emotionally raw story about a young woman surviving abuse. This is one of those books that's so rich and layered that I find new things in it every time I read it. I've read this book, I think, 3 times. Interestingly, even though it's a retelling of a totally different story, I find it hard to believe that Juliet Marillier was not inspired by Deerskin when she wrote Daughter of the Forest. I see some really strong parallels between sort of the structures and approaches of these two books. This book also has wonderful puppies. It's a really great dog story if you're into that. There are several things that come up in enough Robin McKinley books that you start to recognize them as recurring patterns if you read enough of her work. Are there roses? Are there dogs? Does it remind you of Beauty and the Beast? If these things start showing up, there's a chance you may be in McKinley territory. Oh, by the way, did someone else also do a second take at Beauty and the Beast recently? Because Robin McKinley did that first as well. This is Rose Daughter, which was written, about 20 years after Beauty. This was published in 1997, and it is her second full-length retelling of Beauty and the Beast. Both Beauty and Rose Daughter are pretty much straightforward novelizations of the fairy tale, but trust me, they're actually totally different books. This one definitely feels like a more mature and sophisticated retelling for me, and she plays around with the notion of the happy ending here, and by giving us a happy ending that's slightly less traditional, which is a formula that she continued to use for Spindle's End. This is a Sleeping Beauty retelling published in 2000. I'd say this is one of her more slow-moving books. Both this one and Deerskin take place over a long span of time. This book starts out being about one protagonist who is the fairy who takes the young princess away, and then eventually it becomes about Rosie herself. As I said, this has a sort of surprising twist on the happy ending formula. The only thing that I didn't really like so much about this is that it felt like there was a really unnecessary last-minute romance for one of the characters in this that just didn't need to be there, and of which I don't totally approve. It felt really unnecessary. But aside from that, I think this is a wonderful retelling. I just noticed that I'm running out of space on my memory card on my camera, so I gotta take that out and get the footage off of the camera so I can film the rest of this. Okay, I'm back. My daylight is fading, but we're gonna plow through to the end because we're not that far from the end here. We were almost done with Robin McKinley. That was the end of all of her novel-length retellings, but I've left a couple of her short stories for the end here. They're out of chronological order. Now, I haven't read all of McKinley's short fiction. There are some stories of hers that I still haven't read. Specifically, I haven't read the 2 collections of stories that she did in collaboration with Peter Dickinson. I'm kind of intentionally putting those off because I like the idea of having something by her that I haven't read, that I still have yet to discover. But I have read her other 2 short story collections, A Knot in the Grain and The Door in the Hedge. A Knot in the Grain doesn't have any retellings in it, but 2 of the 4 stories in The Door in the Hedge are retellings. Those are The Princess and the Frog and The 12 Dancing Princesses. I honestly don't know when those 2 individual stories were written, but this collection appears to have been published in 1981. Moving on, we're finally hitting some actual, real popular booktube books that you probably don't need me to recommend to you, but I will anyways because I'm being pretty exhaustive with what's on my shelves here. The Lunar Chronicles by Marissa Meyer, very well-known young adult sci-fi fairy tale mashup series. The first book, Cinder, is Cinderella. The second book, Scarlet, is Little Red Riding Hood. As a side note, this is my least favorite of the retellings in this series. I don't particularly approve in general of the concept of Little Red Riding Hood being interpreted as a romance. It's pretty clearly, to me, supposed to be a cautionary tale in which the literal predator is meant to warn against a different kind of predator. I'm not losing my mind, right? The third book, Cress, is Rapunzel, and the fourth book, Winter, is Snow White. As far as retellings go, I also like to mention that one of the stories in the short story collection, Stars Above, The Little Android, is a Little Mermaid retelling that does tie into the main plot of the rest of the series a bit, but it does stand on its own as a retelling and it can be read apart from the rest of the series. I haven't yet read the graphic novel Wires and Nerve that's part of this series, and part of the reason I've been hesitant to is because, as far as I can tell, there are no new fairy tales in that one. And I'm in this series for the fairy tale sci-fi mashup, specifically. And if you're gonna keep writing this series, and there are going to be no more fairy tales, then it feels kind of like you're kicking a dead horse, right? Am I the only one who feels this way about this series? keeping going like this. Next, I have a book that has way stauncher fans on BookTube than myself, but I thought I should include it so that I have some representation on my list of things that are retellings of stories other than fairy tales. So, The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller is an Iliad retelling. It is really beautifully written. The reason I wasn't the hugest fan of this book is just because, sort of the obvious, it is a tragedy. I am personally just not the hugest fan of reading tragedies when I know how badly they're going to end. And if you know the Iliad at all, you will know how absolutely devastatingly this book is going to end for these characters. But if you want a tearjerker Trojan War book, this is it. And then the last physical book I've got here to show you is Six Gun Snow White by Catherynne and Valente. This is a novella-length book. This is a newer edition of this book. It was originally published in 2013 with a cover that looked like that. As you're probably aware, Valente is known for her fairy tale-inspired writing. But so far, this is the only book of hers that I've read that's a direct retelling. Also on my TBR, though, is another novella of hers, Speak Easy, which I believe is a retelling of The 12 Dancing Princesses. I also should mention while I'm holding this book up that I got my copy of this signed when I went to the Brooklyn Book Festival last year. She spoke on a panel discussion there that was absolutely brilliant. And then, having gotten to the end of the alphabet, I want to take time to talk about just a few short stories. I don't really track my short fiction reading, so I'm probably missing a lot here, but just off the top of my head, I read a while ago the first book in the Snow White Blood Red anthology series. This is a series of fairy tale retelling anthologies that I'm definitely planning on continuing on with, although I found the quality of this first installment to be really hit or miss. There were two stories in this that I really particularly enjoyed. The first was The Moon is Drowning While I Sleep by Charles DeLint. That's a retelling of a pretty obscure fairy tale that I never heard of until I read this retelling of it that's, I think, called The Buried Moon. And then the second one that I really loved in this anthology was The Snow Queen by Patricia McKillop, which is a retelling of The Snow Queen, pretty obviously. Now, since I read this anthology, which was an interlibrary loan, I have since purchased short story collections by each of these authors that feature those particular stories, although I haven't read the other stories in either of those collections yet. The Moon is Drowning While I Sleep, I believe, is in Dreams Underfoot, which is a collection of his Newford stories, and I believe that The Snow Queen appears in McKillop's story collection, Harrowing the Dragon. In terms of short fiction that's available to read for free online, I haven't read a ton of really good direct retellings, to be honest. One that I would recommend is The Key to St. Medusa's by Kat Howard. I'll provide a link to that so you can go read it. That is a Bluebeard retelling that's really good. Another Bluebeard retelling that I didn't think was quite as good but is also free to read online is The Maiden Thief by Melissa Marr. As I said, I'm sure I've read others, but I don't track that online short fiction reading. It's kind of something I do helter-skelter for fun when I get distracted on the internet. But I'm actually pretty surprised at how few of the short stories I read online are direct retellings. If you know of some that I really should read, please let me know. I also just have a ton of fairy tale anthologies on my TBR. In particular, I'm getting to be embarrassed that I haven't yet read The Starlit Wood. I have it right there. I remain, as always, super excited to read that book, I just haven't yet. Anyhow, I think we've sort of just wound down to the end of my list of retellings here. I realize that I've gotten out of practice with filming monthly recommendations. I forgot to tell you at the beginning that Monthly Recommendations is a Goodreads group created by Trina from Between Chapters and Kayla Rain. I will link the information for the group down below so you can check it out. Anyhow, have you read any of these books? Do you want to read them? Any others you want to talk to me about? I hope you're having a nice day. That is all. Bye for now.